In Great Britain, when learning to drive, it's common to be asked to use the handbrake when a pause becomes a wait. So if you're waiting in traffic, it's handbrake on, also known as the parking brake, and foot brake off. I was taught to do this when I was learning to drive back in 2004, I remember, and when I started teaching in 2009, I was told to teach this, and I did. For years, I asked my pupils to use the handbrake when waiting in traffic. It's not mandatory though. As long as you maintain good control of your car, the car doesn't roll unexpectedly when you're waiting. It's not marked on the driving test in Great Britain if you don't use the handbrake when you're waiting in traffic. So why is it then? 5, 6 or 7 years ago, I can't quite remember how long ago, but it's a long time ago, I stopped asking my pupils to use the handbrake when they're waiting. In fact, I stopped using it myself. I only ask my pupils to use it when they're parking or if it's to help them with a hill start. Well, it's because I found it caused more harm than good. At least it did in my experience. So in this video, I'm going to explain exactly how. I'm going to start with the reasons I used to give to my pupils for using the handbrake when waiting in traffic. The first one is Rule 114 in the Highway Code, where it recommends, it's not a legal requirement, but it's a recommendation that you use the handbrake when waiting in traffic instead of the foot brake, so that the glare from the brake lights doesn't affect vehicles behind. And I used to tell this to my pupils. We'll be in traffic, looking at brake lights, and I'll tell them this. All the while, the brake lights weren't affecting me, even if it was dark, and they didn't seem to be affecting the pupil. I also used to think, how on earth are we going to deal with the headlights from the oncoming cars, especially when it's raining and they're causing glare, making it hard to see, if we can't deal with the brake lights? There's only been one occasion where I have been affected by brake lights, and they weren't standard brake lights. They were much brighter than usual, more bright than the other cars on the road. That wasn't nice. So I didn't feel like I was convincing myself, and I didn't feel like I was convincing my pupil. It felt like a weak reason. In fact, I don't ever recall sitting next to a person who complained about how bright the brake lights were. Another reason I used to give, and this reason seems to have more strength, although when you look into it more, it gets weaker, is if a car behind hits you and you go forwards, you're less likely to hit the car in front if your handbrake is on than if you're on the foot brake. It's not really true, because the foot brake controls all 4 wheels and is hydraulic. So you've got 4 wheels gripping the road, 4 tyres, and powerful hydraulic brakes. The handbrake usually, in the vast majority of cars, only does the rear wheels. So you've got 2 tyres gripping the road and 2 brakes, and they're cable operated, so they're not very strong. The argument is, if someone hits you hard enough that you're knocked unconscious or you slip off the brake pedal, you're not going to hit the car in front. If someone hits this car hard enough that a person driving is going to be knocked unconscious, or it's going to make them come off the brake, we're going forwards with the handbrake on or not. The foot brake is much more secure. If you're on the foot brake, you're able to keep the car stopped much more than the handbrake will. If you're knocked unconscious, if you hit that hard, you're hitting that car in front anyway. Whether or not it would be worse or better with the handbrake on, well, that's questionable. It depends when you were to release the foot brake. Where this reason actually has more validity is when you're at the front of the queue. Because if someone hits you hard enough that you get knocked unconscious or you slip off the brake and you're at the front of the queue, well, you're going to go flying forwards and you don't know what you're going to go into. Maybe it's a person, you don't know. So having the handbrake on, if it survives the impact, is better than being unconscious with no brakes. But in this car, and I'm fairly certain in many cars, it's not really valid anymore, because cars have what's known as post-collision braking or multi-collision braking, post-crash braking, where if it detects a collision, it brakes the wheels if the collision is hard enough. I don't know what cars have it and what cars don't. This car though is 10 years old nearly. Well, it came to market in 2012, so the design is over 10 years old, and safety systems in cars have moved on significantly. So I still think it's a good idea to use the handbrake at the front of the queue, but when you're in a queue, I don't see it as much of an advantage, especially if the car behind has already stopped and the car behind that has already stopped, because no one's going to go flying into the back of you if you're in a queue of traffic, because everyone's stationary. Where I do get nervous is when I'm approaching a queue of traffic on a fast road, say 50+ miles per hour, and there's no cars behind me. This is where leaving the handbrake off is actually a lot more safe in my opinion. What I do is I stop far back, 4, maybe even 5 car lengths back from the car in front, and I put my hazard lights on. Then I watch. When it's clear the car behind recognises the traffic and they're slowing down, I will turn the hazard lights off. And as I'm in gear with the handbrake off, if it looks like they can't stop in time and they're struggling to stop, I have some room to move forwards, and I'm ready to move forwards to increase their stopping distance. So being further back alerts them of the problem earlier, makes them react earlier, but also it gives you an escape if you need to move forwards to prevent a collision. This is the sort of road I'm talking about. It has a 60 mile per hour limit, and just over the brow of this hill is often a queue of cars waiting at the junction. It gets quite busy here at rush hour, not busy at the moment. And it can be frightening when I'm waiting here in the queue of traffic and I look in the mirror and see a car come flying over the hill and then slamming on the brakes and squirming, struggling to stop before they go into the back of me. This is not somewhere where I want to be waiting in neutral with the handbrake on. I want to be ready to move forwards and try and move out the way if possible. This is the junction I'm coming up to now. Very common for this to be busy at rush hour. I'm now going to demonstrate how weak the handbrake is. I'm going to lift it up quite firm. That's enough to keep this car stationary on a steep hill, and I'm going to try and drive with the handbrake on. So first gear, let's get going. Bit of noise from the brake there. It's beeping at me, telling me that the handbrake's been left on, but it's driving fine. Feels like there's a bit more engine braking, and if I press the clutch down, it slows down and it stops eventually, but it didn't stop quickly. However, if I take the handbrake off now and start driving around the car park, I am off-road here, and if I was to press the brake when driving with the gas on, stop the car pretty much instantly and stalled the engine, even though I was still on the gas. The foot brake is far more powerful than the handbrake. My bag even fell off with my camera bit off the rear seat there. In my experience, electronic parking brakes are more powerful than the lever type, but it does depend on how high you lift them. And on some models, if you activate the electronic parking brake when you're in motion, it doesn't only apply braking force to the rear wheels, but all 4 wheels hydraulically to stop the car quickly as a safety backup. Now, I need to mention that when you're on the move on the public highway, you shouldn't apply the handbrake unless it's an emergency and it's the only way you're going to be able to stop the car, because lifting the handbrake up when the car is in motion can unsettle the car and make it skid or slide. It's known as the handbrake turn. If that sounds like fun to you, there is a place where you can practice it safely and legally. It's in Hemel Hempstead and it's called Drift Limits. Another example of how weak the handbrake is that I actually did 2 laps of Castle Combe race circuit with the handbrake on before I realised that I had left the handbrake on, at speeds of up to 120 miles an hour. Now, I did think the car was feeling a bit odd. It did feel a bit strange, but it wasn't that obvious. And as it's a rear-wheel drive car that I was driving, you don't get the difference in how, when you try to move away, the bum sort of sits down. It just goes normally, and there's more braking effect when you come off the gas. The handbrake wasn't on hard enough to cause the car to slide, but it did feel dodgy. And when I realised 2 laps in that the handbrake was on, I slowed down, did a cool down lap, came off the circuit, and my rear wheels were smoking. But it's just an example of how weak the handbrake can be. You can actually drive the car, and if there's no alarm to let you know you may drive the car for quite some time without even realising it. So they're the reasons for using the handbrake when waiting in traffic. Glare from brake lights, and you're less likely to go as far forwards if someone hits you from behind, although, as I've explained, that's not necessarily the case. They aren't the reasons though why I stopped asking my pupils to use the handbrake when they're waiting. One of the reasons was I found I was causing my pupils more stress and making it harder to learn to drive by asking them to do it. Most people waiting in traffic wait with their foot on the brake. When the traffic starts moving or the traffic lights go green, they get going. Whereas my pupil now has to clutch down into gear, gas, lift the clutch up as they get in the handbrake off. It just takes them longer and it's harder. My job as a driving instructor is to make learning to drive easier, and I found getting them to use the handbrake when they're waiting only added to complication, making learning to drive a less pleasurable and more difficult experience. Not my job to do that. Another reason is I'm more likely to be rear-ended when I get my pupils to use the handbrake when waiting in traffic. If you're an experienced driver, it may be hard to remember what it was like to learn to drive. But with all the things going through a new driver's head, having to take the handbrake off when they get going is an extra thing to do. And they're more likely to stall when moving away if they've got to do this as well. Maybe they don't take it off properly or they forget. The car starts to move forwards and then it stalls and stops without the brake lights going on. The car behind sees our car start to move along with all the traffic, they start going, and then we suddenly stop. And whether or not they have time to stop for us before going into the back of us, well, that's not in my control, unless I stop asking my pupil to put the handbrake on when waiting in traffic. Another reason is that you can actually damage an automatic transmission if you apply the handbrake when waiting. This isn't going to happen to all autos, and it's quite rare, but it can happen. Some autos, if you leave them in D, or whatever the forward setting is for that particular automatic transmission, usually it's D for drive, it can be A, it can be E, and you apply the handbrake and come off the foot brake, the car's going to try and creep forwards. If it's a clutch-based system, that's going to damage the clutch quickly, leading to an expensive repair bill. This is why if you're driving an auto, it's best practice, if you're in drive and you want to stay stationary, stay on the foot brake. If you want to apply the parking brake and be more secure, make sure you select either neutral first or park, depending on the transmission you have. Not all autos have a park setting. And then apply the handbrake so there's no risk of the car trying to creep with your handbrake on. The DVSA actually gives some bad advice here, in my opinion. The official DVSA Guide to Driving the Essential Skills states, in vehicles fitted with automatic transmission, the use of the parking brake is even more important. The parking brake will help avoid the possibility of the vehicle creeping forwards. Now, the fact they're saying creeping forwards suggests that you're still in drive, because the car is only going to try and creep forwards when you're in drive, or creep backwards when you're in reverse. And they're suggesting you use the handbrake to stop the car from creeping. That is bad advice. You don't want to be using the handbrake to stop the car from creeping. Make sure you use the foot brake, select neutral or park first, then apply the handbrake if you wish. Because I wouldn't say it's not going to take long, but it's possible that one day you're going to drive an automatic where doing that will cause an expensive repair bill. Another reason is brake lights. I actually find a line of brake lights an easy way to see a cue up ahead. It's an early warning. And if you're a driving instructor, I wouldn't be surprised if this has happened to you before. And if you're a learner driver and you've done this, don't worry, lots of learners have. You're driving along and you see some traffic lights up ahead and you stop and join a line of parked cars, thinking that it's a cue for the traffic lights. An easy way to tell the difference is the line of parked cars, well, they don't have brake lights on, but the line of traffic queuing up for the lights, they do have brake lights on. You could say, well, the position is different, but the street I'm thinking of, it's narrow and there's 2 lanes. So if you're in the left lane, you're near the curb anyway. So the brake lights can actually make it easier to judge. And there are two other reasons, but I already mentioned them when I was mentioning the reasons to use the handbrake. And that is the foot brake stronger, and cars have safety systems these days. Not that you should be relying on those. The reason why I've made this video is because I often see comments where people are asking, why aren't you using the handbrake when you're waiting? Or my instructor always tells me to use the handbrake when I'm waiting, or you failed your driving test. You should be using the handbrake. You should know better. You're a driving instructor, or you're ignorant. You don't know what you're doing. The fact is, I have done that for years. It's just that I have learnt that not doing it has actually been safer for me. I have been more successful at helping people learn to drive in a less stressful way, making it easier for them. And I've had less incidents, because stalling as you move away, well, that causes problems. Taking out something that makes it harder to drive makes it easier. I do explain to my pupils that you can use the handbrake. I explain why. I explain Rule 140 in the highway code, and that it's recommended. But whether or not they do it is up to them. In the early stages, I don't recommend it to them, because it just makes it harder. If they want to start doing it later, they can. Whether or not they do it when they pass their driving test, well, that's never up to me. I can think that what I tell my pupils to do, they'll do for the rest of their lives, but I know that's not the case. You just need to look at accurate traffic, at some traffic lights and all those brake lights, to know that the vast majority of people aren't still pulling up the handbrake when they're waiting in traffic. Meaning, all of the trouble I've gone to in getting them to do it during their lessons, and the fact it's caused them more stress and led to more incidents, has all been for nothing. In not using the handbrake, I've had less problems. I've been more successful at teaching people to drive. I'm not making this video to tell you how to teach or to tell you how to drive. Drive in a way that suits you and teach in a way that suits you, so long as it's safe and legal. I'm just explaining why I no longer get my pupils to use the handbrake when waiting in traffic. It's not that I'm ignorant and don't know about it. I did it for years. I just have my reasons why I stopped doing it, and I explained those reasons in this video. It's actually good that instructors don't all have to teach in the exact same way, because you can have two instructors. Let's say instructor A and instructor B. One pupil may find A terrible, useless, can't help me at all, but B brilliant. Yet a different pupil may find B rubbish and A brilliant. The fact that we're different means there's more choice, meaning that if a learner driver is struggling with someone, they've got choice to try someone else to see how it goes. If we're all the same, well, there wouldn't be much point in changing, because it'll be going from one person to another and having the same problems. So the fact we're different gives learner drivers more choice, which helps people learn to drive. Also, the fact that we're different means that more instructors can be good at the job. If we all had to do the work in the exact same way, this job would suit less people. Less people would be happy doing it. The fact that we can develop our own methods is nice. It helps us enjoy the job. It's less restrictive. What we do need to have in common is that we're safe and legal. When you give people a level of freedom where they can improvise, it can be surprising what methods, ideas or solutions they come up with. But when you put them in a box and make them do everything in the exact same way, they're unlikely to think for themselves. Things are unlikely to ever improve or move forwards. If you found this video helpful, please give it a thumbs up, and if you're looking for car insurance, check out the links to Collingwood and Confused in the description. If you're learning to drive and want to insure yourself on somebody else's car, then Collingwood are there for you, because you can do so without affecting the owner's policy, and that takes away a big stress from the owner of that car. Via the link at the moment, there's up to 35% off and a £20 Amazon gift card. If you want to insure your own car, I recommend checking out the link to confused.com, because you fill out one quote form and get loads of quotes back from many insurers to compare who's cheapest. And you can change your car on that quote as many times as you like to compare how much it costs to insure different cars. Using the links doesn't cost you anything, but it does support the channel, so thank you very much. Subscribe to get my future videos, and until the next one, cheerio.